Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Laura, Head of Product here in Kodiak Hub, and today we're going to explore a simplified version of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is quite new. They just approved it in April, so it's quite timely for us to explore how Kodiak can bring value for your company regarding this legislation. So with that in mind, today we will talk a little bit about the importance of compliance in the business landscape, a little bit of a general knowledge there on why this legislation is important. Then we're going to talk about what is the CSDDD, why it's being implemented, and something that we have here from now on that sometimes people confuse the CSDDD with the CSRD. So we're going to have a little bit of a stop and compare both of them because they're quite different, but they live in the same ecosystem. After that, we're going to talk about a step-by-step guide based on the legislation on how to implement this in your companies. But you will see throughout this presentation that CSDDD is quite a large topic. So after that, we're going to focus especially on your supply chain, how to involve your suppliers. And then finally, we're going to recap with some first steps that you can take now that this legislation is approved. So let's begin. What is the importance of compliance in today's business landscape? I brought you some, I believe, quite impressive numbers about how stakeholders see or perceive companies regarding their sustainability practices. So, for example, 77% of all consumers are motivated to purchase from companies who are committed to making our world better. It's very important for companies to have a purpose. It seems that it's affecting consumers' perception. It's not about only cost and quality anymore. They want to know that the companies that they are engaging, that they're sponsoring, have good practices. As this is not only true for consumers, it's also true for investors. 73% of investors state that efforts to improve environment and society can contribute to make their investment decisions. And this is not quite new, but it's quite important for companies to navigate in the current business landscape. We have all heard of the sustainability funds, which they check not only the productivity of the companies they're investing, but also their sustainability practices. Another super important stakeholder are employees. Our companies need invested and engaged employees to achieve their business practices. And some data says that 88% of those employees are not willing to work for a company that is only making money at the expense of society at large. These are very important numbers that we should keep in mind from now on, because due diligence has always been related to risk management. It's minimizing risk, making sure that everything is working in order. And this is, of course, extremely important to make sure that our businesses are working as they should, but it's not only about risk minimization anymore. Stakeholders are checking that everything is working as they should. They are engaged with companies with good practices. So due diligence now has become a mechanism to bring stakeholder value. With that in mind, I would love to take a little bit of a look on some use cases, which are quite interesting when you see them one against the other. So let's learn from others' experiences. The first one is Boohoo. Boohoo is a British fashion label that in 2020 got involved with some modern slavery allegations from the NGO Labor Behind the Label and the Sunday Times. After this was published by the Sunday Times, Boohoo share price dropped 50% in the next following days, which is quite an impact for a company to have. As well, some retailers actually pull their products from their offering, Amazon, ASOS, and Zalando, for example. So this was a big blow for Boohoo in 2020. Something similar happened to H&M. In 2018, they were related, or the Financial Times reported that H&M had some dealings with forced labor in China. What happened with the share price on H&M? It remained steady. There wasn't any impact. And their investors did not react significantly to this. But why? Why did modern slavery scandal impact Boohoo so much more than H&M? What is the difference between these two brands? And first of all, the scandal was very similar between them, but the biggest difference was the response. H&M has a very robust human rights due diligence process that they have implemented based on the UN guiding principles for business and human rights. So they have a lot of experience, and they have this risk management system that they have implemented over time, which is very mature. They knew how to respond to this crisis. And that's something that is perceived by different indexes and different indicators. For example, the Fashion Transparency Index or the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. So this gives a lot of credibility to H&M. At the same time, when this happened, the first statement that they said, and they were very clear about it, is like they will conduct an investigation based on their management system, and if there's a violation, they will cease to work with those suppliers. That wasn't the reaction from Boohoo. It was actually quite different. They have been for a long time criticized by their approach. They rank in the second lowest tier of the Fashion Transparency Index in 2019 and 2020, and they have not been included in the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. So this didn't give a lot of credibility to Boohoo. So what can we learn from this? Is that the management systems work. They are designed to be used in a rainy day. And that's what exactly H&M did. They were able to have a quick and credible response. They were able to identify the risks and improve the supplier conditions. And at the end of the day, they have more resilient supply chain. All of this, combined by how transparent they are and how visible their practices are, gave them credibility with indexes, which helps with investors. And that's why in 2018, they had a less problems to bounce back compared to Boohoo. So this is a nice testament that it is important for us to have processes in place. Now that we have established how important this is for all companies, for all stakeholders, let's talk about the CSDDD. The CSDDD is a new legislation that has been approved by the EU that aims to establish obligation for companies. You need to identify, prevent, and mitigate impacts. So it's pretty much a risk management system. The biggest thing about this law is that it makes accountable companies for external impacts. They aim to make sure that companies have a business model and a strategy that is compatible with sustainable economy, as well as a close relationship with the Paris Agreement. So that's the main focus of the directive. It has three different dimensions. The first thing is your own operations, then your subsidiaries or sites, and of course, your supply chain. During this webinar, we're going to focus on the legislation as a whole. What do you need to do according to the legislation? But at the end, we will focus very much on supply chain and how can you use Kodiak to manage this process. Another big difference or another aspect of the CSDDD is the scope. The scope changed during these debate processes between the Commission and the Parliament. Now it's applicable for large companies, over 1,000 employees, and a network of 450 million euros. There is also applicable for parent companies that of a group of companies who meet that threshold, or companies with a franchise or a license with royalties over 22.5 million in the EU. It also applies to third-party country legislation, which includes more than 450 million euros in net turnover. Now, this is the companies that they need to report, that they need to comply with the law. But every company out there will be affected by this. Why? Because customers of these large companies will require changes to their suppliers. And those suppliers will require changes to other suppliers. So it's a little bit of a chain effect that means that everybody will be affected or fall a little bit on the umbrella of this company, of this law. Now let's talk about why is this legislation being approved, or it was approved by the Parliament. Well, the EU economy is responsible for the well-being of thousands of workers. It is also responsible about the environmental conditions of so many communities. And that's even bigger when you put the global chain, value chain in top of that. European unions have a very complex and globalized supply chain. So that means that the impact of their economic activities is exponential. It's a little bit a chain of events that have the root cause in the EU. That's why the Parliament decided to approve this law. And those consequences can really affect the human, the lives of these workers, both the human rights and health and safety, for example. The law has been very much advertised about human rights and environmental impacts, but they also explicitly said that health and safety is one of the things that we need to mitigate and make sure that the workers have a safe environment. Regarding the environment, it's not only about climate change, although the legislation does explicitly says that we need to keep in limit with the global warming of 1.5, which is what the Paris Agreement is based on, but it also encompasses other types of environmental impacts, like, for example, water pollution, air pollution, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem degradation. Of course, it's because these impacts, once more, they are related to the economic activities of EU companies. Therefore, the law wants to make them accountable and responsible for those impacts. Now, many of our users, we have heard that they're a bit confused between the CSDDD and the CSRD. They are very similar laws, or at least they have a similar name, and they're all in the same ecosystem. So I think it's important for us to stop and check what are the differences between them. First of all, the CSDDD is like a big combination, or includes a lot of other legislations. They make reference to them. For example, the conflict mineral report, the EU taxonomy, they have a lot of reference already in the law. And one of the main results of this is because there has been so many local or national legislations. For example, the Lieferkettengesetz in Germany, the Norwegian Transparency Act, France as well has another due diligence, that the EU decided to basically have all of these legislations in one umbrella where companies are liable. That's very different than the reporting, the CSRD directive. They have different objectives. The objective, as I mentioned, of the CSRD is just to ensure that companies do due diligence. The CSRD, on the other side, they want to standardize the reporting of sustainability information. So it's very different, as I mentioned. The CSRD comes to complement the CSDDD. The scope is also quite different. As I mentioned before, CSDDD is for larger companies or larger enterprises. The CSRD is more for large companies, but also small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as non-EU companies. Finally, we have the content. The CSDDD, they give us like a little map of how to do our due diligence. And this is what we're going to see in upcoming slides. It tells us how to arrive there, and also it makes it liable. The CSRD, on the other side, it focuses on data quality and standardization. So it tells you how to report, how to communicate about the policies, the risks, and the key performance. Finally, the implementation, and here's what the biggest difference I believe it arrives, is that the CSRD is a legal framework to hold companies accountable. So it is a law to make sure that there's mechanisms to take a company to court and make sure that they are complying with human rights and environmental rights. CSRD, on the other hand, is just focused on making data accessible for every stakeholder in a way that is comparable, reliable, and easy to understand. So quite different, but still they play with each other, especially the CSRD, and we will see why in a second. So let's go with this step-by-step approach, or this step-by-step guide. The first thing is, well, this is, as you can see, 7 steps, all come from the law directly, from the articles 4 to 7. They're very specific, so the legislation is there for you to consult. The first thing is integrating due diligence into policies and risk management system, basically a little bit of standardization and compliance. Then identifying, assessing actual potential impacts. After you assess those impacts, you either need to stop or basically eliminate those impacts or prevent and mitigate the potential impact. It also requires companies to have a whistleblowing policy or a complaint mechanism and to have performance on those policies. The legislation also has a massive transparency and communication focus. So let's go step by step. The first thing is integrating due diligence into policies. Policies are what companies are promising their stakeholders, either their employees, their investors, the communities where they're operating, and also their suppliers. So it's very important to have very robust and clear policies that you can share with anybody. Those policies cannot be set on stone. They need to be reviewed every 24 months according to the legislation. And every time that they are reviewed, you need to include what impacts have been identified and which measures have been taken. So this is, as I mentioned before, quite important to keep it alive, never to make it set on stone. And because this type of policies need to be communicated to the stakeholders. They need to include the long-term approach of everything that you're expecting to do in that period of 24 months. They also need to have a code of conduct outlining what is the consequences of a breach. What happens if a supplier commits a violation? And of course, they need to talk about the processes that they're implementing. So they need to mention the risk management system and how they're going to do it. Why do we need so much information in these policies? Because as I mentioned before, this is your promise to the stakeholders. This is the promise that your company is doing to the government as well to comply with this law. After you have all of that in place, the next step is to identify, assess the adverse impacts, which is quite important when you're managing risks. It's one of the most important steps of your risk management system. This includes gathering data from different areas, engaging with different stakeholders, and considering the likelihood and severity of those impacts. Something that the law allows you to do, and this is very important in supply chain, we will mention it in a couple of minutes, is prioritization of the identified impacts. The legislators know that you cannot address everything at the same time. So the legislation allows you to prioritize those impacts in a way that you can address them one at a time. But this is very important. It also says that you can not only address the most severe ones, you need to address all of the identified impacts in the long run. So it gives you a little bit of leeway on how to address them, but it also reminds you that you need to cover absolutely everything. After you have identified the impacts, you have basically two types. The potential impacts, the ones who hasn't happened yet, but they might happen, and the actual impacts. For your potential impacts, those things that are in danger of occurring, but they haven't occurred just yet, you need to implement a preventive action plan. And this is important because some companies, they stay only with what they found, but the law is actually requesting for you to be prepared in case of a breach. That hasn't happened yet, but it might happen. Part of the things that you need to implement in this preventive action plan is to seek contractor assurance to make sure that your business partners are complying with the CSDDD. You also need to provide support to those business partners. And of course, make sure that those plans are time-bound and have targets. This is very important. So this is when things haven't happened, they might happen. But if you find actual impacts that have affected any stakeholder, either suppliers, communities, employees, we need to stop them right away. We need to put an end to them as fast as humanly possible. Additionally to that, we need to minimize their extent and minimize their impact, the damage they're doing. So in that case, you implement a corrective action plan. You need to have a remediation plan with the stakeholders, seeing how can you reduce the damage that it has already caused. And of course, make sure that in the contracts, it states with these suppliers or these business partners that if this happens again, the business relationship will end. So these are there are two sides of the same coin, potential impacts versus actual impacts. Both of them are very important, but of course, according to the prioritization, you need to address the current impacts faster. Another part of the legislation is the compliance mechanism, something that we call the whistleblowing system. This is quite important because it's a process that allows different stakeholders, employees, suppliers, community members, to actually make a complaint. This process has to be accessible, transparent, and effective. It is very important that every stakeholder has access to this. So, for example, if you have suppliers in different regions, it's important to have accessible language for them and their employees. They need also handle every single complaint. They need to be quick and fair and impartial every time that you investigate those complaints. Because, of course, you'd never take a complaint at face value. There has to be a process to actually investigate that complaint and reach a conclusion. Once you do that, that's where you start with the remediation and corrective action plans. Something that is extremely important in whistleblowing systems or complaint mechanisms is to have anonymity. Make sure that the stakeholder who is doing the complaint is protected for any retaliation. So this is key. Always make it anonymous. But it is important to engage with that stakeholder, communicate with them, and make sure that you are providing all of this documentation to them at the end of the day, for them and any other stakeholders. Finally, and this is one of my favorite steps of this law, and I appreciate that they have included this, is the performance of those policies. The legislation recognizes that even having all of the management systems that you have out there, all of the policies, that if you don't have robust KPIs that can measure the outcomes of those policies, there's no value in it. So this is something that in all honesty is quite new. not all of the due diligence law recognize performance as one of the key aspects, but it's extremely important for companies to start making that change of mindset. That is not only risk, it's about the performance of those activities that you're planning, either from the beginning or in a corrective action plan or in a preventive action plan. So very, very important to sit down, understand what are the KPIs and how you're going to measure them. Some of those KPIs can be actually qualitative assessments that you have with internal stakeholders, with different employees. Many of our users, sometimes they ask us, what is a sustainability KPI? What are we looking for? And there's many examples, but for example, health and safety, you can ask how many accidents has a supplier has or a business had in a particular year, how many deaths, what is the coverage of protective equipment on the employees, things of that nature. But it is quite important, and it's very refreshing to see that a due diligence law is recognizing the importance of performance in their processes. Finally, we have transparency and communication. This is something that we see and we recognize from many legislations out there, the Legal Category Sense, the Transparency Act, an importance and a focus on transparency and communication at every single step of the way. It means that you need to do an annual report that includes all of the impacts that you have found in your operations, in your sites, or in your supply chain, and how you have been addressing this. And this needs to be accessible to the public at any given time. What it means is that you need to have a very robust and quick system because you don't know when someone is going to knock at your door. So it is important to have a centralized place where everything is very clear on how you move forward. Because you don't want to arrive at a moment that if someone knocks at your door, that you won't be able to present this documentation. It also talks about supplier or stakeholder engagement. And this means that you need to reach out to the stakeholders. As I mentioned before, this legislation is for all of your operations and subsidiaries. So it means that you need to talk with your community, with your employees, but also with the suppliers, and make sure that they have a clear understanding of your policies, of your practices, and your processes. Finally, this is an extra step, but it's something that the legislation also mentions, is leadership. Leadership has to be involved and has to endorse every step of the way, not only the policies, but also the management system that allows you to identify and prevent those risks. Why is this important? Because this legislation is about liability. So the leaders cannot say, I didn't know. So it is so important for them to have an eye every step of the way, and that you have buy-in from your leadership when you're implementing this legislation. So we have talked a lot about the law itself, right? Operations, subsidiaries, and now let's focus on the supply chain. What can you do to implement this part? Because I can tell you, this is the hardest part. You have control of your operations. You have control of the subsidiaries. You know what is going on there. Your supply chain, on the other hand, is about the relationship that you have with the supplier. And that is where it gets tricky because it's not longer under your control. So thank heavens you're a customer of Kodiak, so you have already a tool to manage that relationship. And this is where you can use this tool every step of the way, and we will see it now. So this is the process that you have for an entire law. Every single step is reliant to the supply chain as well. So the first one, which was all about policies and risk management systems, how that looks like in your supply chain is about code of conduct and policy communication. So for example, with the improve module or with Insight, you can communicate to your suppliers which are your policies. You need to do this every time that you have a new update. And you can ask them to sign those policies or those code of conduct. Sometimes suppliers decide not to sign a code of conduct because they have already their own. If they have their own, that's okay, as long as the code of conduct includes the CSDDD. Also, it's very important that in those code of conducts or in the contract itself, you have a mechanism to terminate the contract in case of a violation. Or if you find an impact already, it is important to include an amendment saying, like, if this keeps being recurrent, we have the right to protect ourselves, basically, and not have a relationship with you anymore. So that's quite important to always remember with this legislation. You need to have a way out if they don't comply. The second step is about identifying the impact. So here's all about supplier risk assessment. How can you identify those risks? Always, risk is vulnerability per livelihood per impact, the severity of that impact. So with Kodiak, for example, you have early warning data from third-party data sources. Something that is extremely important to know about this risk management is the country. There are some countries that are more vulnerable than others. A supplier is more likely or more vulnerable to commit a violation of human rights in an area outside the EU, for example. So this is something that you can use as a first value from Kodiak. You check how is the country stability, you check the indicator, and you see how well is that ecosystem for that supplier to thrive. You can also use the media insight module for checking news and, of course, safe source for sanctions. If you have a supplier with a sanction related to forced labor or human rights, it is almost automatically a risk supplier. Then the supplier segmentation, this is quite important because it helps you prioritize, and we will see that in a minute. But conducting periodic assessments to your suppliers is quite important as well, because every practice changes. For example, you have seen the law is asking for 24 months of review of the policies. Well, those suppliers, they change as well. So conducting assessments is quite important at every different tier. Audits for your critical or high-risk suppliers is also a really, really good way of gathering information and impacts from your supply chain. And you can do that, of course, with our on-site model. And then, as I mentioned before, risk management is vulnerability per livelihood per impact. It is important to assess the severity of those impacts and the likelihood that they occur. That's how you know which are your risky suppliers. When I say the severity of an impact, it's like there's quite a big difference between the impact of forced labor or child labor to other impacts, for example, biodiversity loss or deforestation. They're both an impact and they're both problematic, but the severity of one is higher than the other. And that's for your industry to decide and your company to decide, but it is important to understand the impacts from a severity level. Why? Because that will help you to prioritize, identify impacts, and making sure that you are addressing the ones who are more severe and more likely to happen before. As I mentioned before, the legislation allows you to do this, but at the end, you need to address every single impact with this sequential addressing methodology that the legislation allows. That's why supplier segmentation is so important. You need to cut the pie to be able to do this faster in a more productive way. Always starting with your most critical or higher risk suppliers. Of course, this is something that you can do in Kodiak thanks to our properties, but also to our rating systems. If you are identifying, you have an assessment for CSDDD, including human rights, environmental rights, it was going to be easier for you to know which are those suppliers with a low rating. That means that they have a high risk, and you can address those first. Then you have to address the potential impacts, but also the current impacts. For the potential impacts, you can just reach out with an improvement or a prevention action plan, support them on those action plans. This is very important, especially for smaller suppliers. It's important for them to be able to grow and grow your relationship with you. So it's very easy. You can do it with an improve or act with an action where you reach out to the supplier and let them know what are the low points that they need to improve. And of course, if they change that, their vulnerability will decrease because they're more resilient. They have practices in place. So this is something that you can do, especially with suppliers in risk countries. Maybe their ecosystem is not the best, but you can help them to have better practices that will reduce their vulnerability and therefore their risk. But if you do find occurring impacts, you need to address them right away with a corrective action plan and set clear consequences with the supplier about what is going to happen if it's not finished, if it continues to do harm. The supplier must implement those corrective action plans. They must engage with the affected stakeholders, either the community or their employees, and they need to provide support for those remedy processes. So all of those things, you need to ask for them as evidence. So when someone comes knocking at your door, you have proof that you have engaged with the supplier and that you have stopped this impact. As I mentioned before, it is important that if you decide to still work with these suppliers, that you have a contractor reassurance that you will not continue with them in case of recurrence. This is very important, not only because it leaves you a door open to improve your resilience, to end a relationship with a supplier, but also because it is a proof for the legislation that you have a mechanism in place. Talking about the whistleblowing system, this is also something that the suppliers should be engaged. They should know about it. They should be able to access it easily and in their language. Their employees, they should also be able to access it. Most important in the whistleblowing system is like companies or persons should be able to report a supplier to you. So you need that dimension in your whistleblowing system. It's not only about your own practices. Always remember to include your suppliers in that process. And of course, you need to document every interaction and ensure transparency every step of the way. Finally, the KPIs. How can you involve or set KPIs for your suppliers related to ESG? Well, as I mentioned before, this is extremely important because it's what tells you what practices are being in place. So if you have this very robust CSDD system that is allowing you to manage those risks, you might as well make sure that they're working. So how can you set up those KPIs? You can use the KPI Insight module. First, if you don't have hard metrics, you can always ask your stakeholders to evaluate the suppliers to make sure that the outcomes and work ethics are aligning with yours. You can also ask the supplier employees for questions and see the metrics there on how they're working. You can also have hard metrics that you ask the supplier. How is your diversity coverage? How many underage employees you have? What is your coverage for PPE? There's so many metrics that are related to sustainability that you can explore, that it's just changing that mindset that performance is not only for quality, it also is super important for sustainability, human rights, and labor rights. After that back and forth and gathering those indicators, make sure that you act on them, that you can improve your current process and your relationship with your suppliers based on that. This is a continuous improvement process. It never ends. It has to be something that you do continuously and have the up-to-date reports and the history for the transparency and communication. So this is what I bring you. I want to have a last slide that you can take with you. It's just like one thing, how to start. And because we have time, the legislation was approved this year. And now countries have until 2026 to make it international law. They can make it faster, but they have until 2026, and then you have a little more time to implement it. Nonetheless, it's a complex topic, so it's good for you to start right away. But how to start? The first thing is to start at home. Check what are your own operations of subsidiaries. Check your own policies. Talk with the sustainability manager at your operations. This is like a quick trick. If you identify your risks already, that is like a little bit of reflection where you will find your suppliers. So for example, if you have identified the usage of certain chemicals that can cause environmental degradation, I can assure you your suppliers will have that too. So it is important to check yourself first, because it will help you a little bit in the future. Then always cut the pie. Segment your suppliers as much as possible. Risk management, it has a relatively easy methodology, but you need to create it yourself. So that's when it gets complicated. So use Kodiak as much as possible, the ratings, to facilitate that segmentation. You need to focus on the vulnerability. You define a range for that vulnerability, which could be your rating system already. You define the country evaluation, the media insight, and then you also assess the severity of those impacts, what it could cause in your organization, but also the likelihood of something happen. The likelihood is the one that most people get a bit confused. We always recommend it to do it depending on your own needs. So for example, you can do it by spend. As much spend you have with a supplier, the risky it is that they have a violation. But you can also do it about the history that you have about the supplier, how they have handled prior violations or issues. And this is very important. Your suppliers can reduce their risk if they improve their practices. So that brings me to step number 3. Start gathering information. Start gathering information. Make sure that your segmentation is also alive. It has to be throughout the entire supplier life cycle. And with the assessments that you gather, you will be able to reevaluate the risk. And this is what you need to prove to the authorities. Finally, make sure that you reclassify the suppliers. Never set them in stone in the onboarding. This is something that you have to do continuously. And like the legislation said before, after that, continue with your second tier, with your less critical suppliers. So first you gather the most important ones, the critical ones, and then you move to the next. And after that, I think you are in the right track, and you just continue doing this process. And once you've identified the impacts, of course, you will know what to do. Is it a corrective action plan? Is a preventive action plan? Perfect. This is what I brought you today. I see some questions in the chat. Please write if you have any other questions. But I have one here. Do you expect any changes to the law, or is start due to the election results? I don't believe so, because this was already approved in April. So I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think they can reverse it. It's already a legislation in the EU by April 24. So we just need for the member states to approve it in their parliament. I don't think you can pull out of these type of legislations. Every single member state has to approve it. Is the CSDDD ratified by the UK or the US? No. This is EU legislation. Nonetheless, the UK has the Modern Slavery Act, which has a smaller scope than the CSDDD, but is similar. The US had the Dobbs Act, which is way smaller than that as well, but it will affect your suppliers in the UK and the US will be affected by this if they have businesses in the EU over 450 million, or because, of course, you need to gather their information. Yes, we will send you this recording. I believe also in handouts, you can have this presentation. Let's see, for large organizations, so we're, I'm gonna say assume 1,000 suppliers. Does it make sense to use the existing risk segmentation if it is mostly based on continuity of supply? That depends on your risk segmentation. Every company has different risk methodologies. If it's based on continuity of supply, no, it will be, that will be your continuity risk, right? Now you need to come with a risk management system for human rights, labor rights, and environment, ESG, pretty much. So it depends on how it's handled. I don't want to say no right away, but if it's just based on continuity of supply of delivery, I think we will either have to create a new one or expand that one so it encompasses labor rights, human rights, and environmental. That's why we have the rating areas, so you can play around with what you need in different areas. Awesome. I don't see any other questions. I always enjoy these sessions because I see how the tool can help you. Oh, there's a new question here. This is not applicable to UK companies. Yes, exactly. So it, as I mentioned, it's not, the UK companies are not under the law, but of course, if they have businesses in the EU, they will be applicable, depending on how much turnover they have. Very good. Thank you so much for today. If you have any other questions, please just let me know. If you want to have a little bit more in-depth conversation about the CSDDD in Kodiak, please also reach out to your CSM, and we can see how can we do. We always recognize that this discovery class are for all of our customers, so they're very high level. So if you want to detail in one specific thing, just let us know. We're always happy to help and for you to use the product as much as possible. I hope that you have a good midsummer for those in Sweden, and happy summer. Thank you.